Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Internal Use Only podcast. My name is Dan Sullivan, your host. Today, we are joined by Brian Kirk to discuss the 2026 compensation survey that he puts together. Before we get to the interview, I want to say thank you to everybody that's followed us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and sign up for the newsletter. If you have not, make sure you do that today. Sign up for the newsletter, check us out on LinkedIn, follow us on socials, particularly Instagram. That's the best way to get all the updates on internal use only. So without further ado, let's welcome Brian Kirk back to the show. Brian, it's been a couple of years, but you and I have obviously
Yeah.
stayed in touch. But I love to have you back on the show, and thank you for carving out time for us and the audience today.
Yeah. Well, no, well, thanks for having me. I told my wife this morning I was doing a podcast and she said, well, why would anybody want to talk to you? And I said, well, I put together these reports and everything. So I guess I'm kind of, as she said, I'm kind of nerd famous here, I guess, at this point.
I wouldn't undersell it because you provide insight into something that's very material and very important in the world of sales and distribution, and that is compensation trends. Why don't we get right into the topic of the day? That is the compensation report. This is for released in 2026, but for those listening, for the audience, for your benefit, this was data that was collected by Brian over the course of calendar year 2025 from about 400 or more contacts. Do I have that right, Brian, as far as how many contributors there were to the survey?
Yeah, and I always tell the folks that I work with, I give this report exclusively to my clients, and I'd say, look, I wouldn't call a board meeting about this, but at the same time, it's not anecdotal either.
You and I did some prep ahead of time, and there were a couple of trends and observations that I thought of that either apply to conversations that I've had both with wholesalers, people in the field, my own experiences over the last year or so. But let's start off with this because this isn't the first iteration of this compensation report. Have there been any major changes over, let's say, the last 2, 3, 4 years, or are the data points kind of similar and it's now just more updated?
Well, I think that you see this trend of just it's kind of like the population of the United States, where the rich are getting richer, the bigger firms are getting bigger, the mid-sized firms are getting squeezed to a degree, and the smaller firms, are doing well, but they're not crushing it like the big firms are, right? And distribution is very difficult to do. It's very expensive, and you've got just a lot of the bigger firms, taking advantage of the fact that they're on with these bigger wirehouse firms and kind of locking that down, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but in terms of just the overall mood of the market, I'd say it's quite positive right now. The leading indicator that I always use as it relates to that, if I'm talking to what I perceive to be as a good candidate, a good wholesaler, if you will, you're in competition and they've got two or three interviews that they're doing, right? It's not just, well, I've got one firm that I'm interviewing with. It's two or three at a time, easily.
That's a stands in contrast to our last conversation. Again, now we're dating ourselves with how much time has elapsed between these episodes. But I feel like at the time, this would have been 2021 or 22. It was a very different sentiment. It was a little more reserved, a little more hesitant, some uncertainty, I think, both in the markets and how firms were staffing and putting out their field forces. So I as a wholesaler podcast, I am obviously loving to hear that it seems like
Yeah,
it's a little bit of a player's market out
there's
there.
a positive vibe out there, and going back to what I talked about in terms of the tier twos, the tier ones, and the tier three firms. Just because a firm is a smaller organization and has a more limited product offering, doesn't mean that they can't be successful as it relates to distribution. I've worked with a firm recently that was building out specifically into the RIA channel. They've got a niche offering and they've been quite successful. Are they going to be the next tier one organization? No. Do they want to be that? No. right? They've come in there and they've had success. They're having the success that they want to have. And so it's not like just because you're small or a mid-sized firm doesn't mean that you can't have success by any means.
If we can spend a moment just to ask a couple questions about that, if to the extent you can share it, I would be interested to hear from a strategic standpoint. What are some of the things that, like in this example, the mid-sized firm, what are they trying to replicate of some of the bigger tier one firms, and what are some of the things that maybe they're trying to stay away with and say, hey, I don't really need that. Like, can you give us any insights into what that may look like from what you've seen?
Well, in terms of being like a bigger firm, or what exactly do you mean?
So if they're targeting the RAA channel, they have a few different strategic ways they're going about doing that. What would you say is unique or different about how they're doing that compared to maybe a tier one firm, if that's an easier way of framing it?
Well, within this example, their comp plan is different. They've adopted what I would refer to as more of an institutional compensation program where they're paying a base salary, they're paying basis points, and they're doing a trail, which a tier one firm uh, would not, in most instances, do. They would pay on new money within the territory. They wouldn't do that. Whereas this firm is saying, hey, you can come on in here. You're a wholesaler for us. We're going to pay you base salary. We're going to pay you basis points, and you're going to get an ongoing trail into perpetuity, which is quite unique. But I've seen that play out on several instances. In fact, it was funny. I put out the report. Sometimes I'll put it on LinkedIn. Sometimes I won't. And one of the folks on there commented. They said, "Wait a minute. There's no way that there's a wholesaler that's out there that makes $2 million a year." And I said, "Well, actually there is. But if you look at that example specifically, um, this person started at that firm with a very low base salary, basis points, was making nothing. They'd been there for 10 years. They got on a few different platforms and he's being paid a trail. And that's how he got there. And I said, "Oh my gosh, you're doing great. You're making that much money. That's fantastic." And he said, "Well, yeah, well, you weren't here in year two when I was eating ramen noodles."
Yeah, the grinded out phase, right?
Right. And
Yeah,
so that's where, some of these smaller firms, in order to get in there, they've adopted different comp plans in order to, become successful in the space.
yeah, and that's management will make their decisions on some of that comp, but it's being boots on the ground and in and around those that are targeting those different channels. If you're not within, like, let's say a mature, developed wirehouse or maybe even an independent broker dealer, objectively, it is still like it can be a 2 to 6 year window before you're really seeing the flows that would substantiate, right? Like, it just takes time. Even the RA channel, had a conversation with a wholesaler in Texas a couple weeks back who had done well within like Denver area for RIAs. And he's like, yeah, man, it takes time. So you can't be going hungry. You can't be desperate for commission based sales either. So it's a hard balance to strike.
Well, as the saying goes, is that a traditional advisor will sell investments to their client, whereas an RAA buys investments for their client. And so that sales process is entirely different. And you talk to some of these folks that don't know much about distribution. I've worked with various sponsors and managers that aren't adept to distribution. They say, "Well, it's all sales, right?" Well, as it relates to RAAs and traditional advisors, no, it's different. It's like stock car racing versus NASCAR. Well, it's all racing, yeah, but the car drives differently, the rules are different, and so it's a different landscape. And
Yeah, it's
I put the number. It between, and I've done a report on this, that within the RIA channel, if there's a person coming in who's trying to get traction within that community, if they're an experienced wholesaler and they've got a new product, it's 18 months in order to get traction. I know one big firm statistically puts the number at a year and between 8 to 9 touches before they would get a ticket, so to speak, or an allocation rather, from an RAA.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
And I would even say that without having a full breakdown of the tiers of it, I would say that's more of an RIA acting like an advisor that might be under the 1 billion AUM marks, that they're still acting on their own to select and vet managers, as opposed to some of these mega aggregators that are effectively now going through the same run of the mill national accounts approach, like a Wirehouse or LPL, like the High Towers of the world, or
Yeah.
wealth enhancement groups of the world, those kind of groups.
Yeah, and that's another thing that is kind of shocked me. All you hear about, you'll talk to folks all the time who will say, well, this team left, a wirehouse to go RIA, and you hear that, all day long. But yet, you talk to some of these firms and they just give their IT to be on a big wirehouse platform. And you say, well, wait a minute, all these folks are going RAA. Well, what's the deal with that, right? And so I'm always kind of confused by that. I'm always scratching my head because, the big wirehouse firms are still very, very, very powerful.
And they still command a majority of the assets. We did an episode with Cerulli Associates earlier in the year, and that was still like, of the report they shared with me, that was one of the first things I noticed, where I was like,
Yeah, it's
you wouldn't realize how much AUM is still commanded by the wirehouses based on how everyone talks.
yeah, the idea of everyone going RIA and the wirehouses are going away, in my opinion, is about as big of a misnomer as wholesaling's going away.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. Well, we've chatted a little bit about the state of wholesaling and some of the things that you're seeing, Brian. Let's get right into some of the report data. For those that are listening in on audio, either on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, feel free to check this out on YouTube. If you're listening on YouTube, you're obviously going to see some visuals. But I thank Brian for making some of this data available to us. I'm going to comb through a few different stats that, as I read this, Brian, they stood out to me, and I'm just going to ask your perspective and opinion on them. So let me queue up the report here for us, and that will get us started. So let's see, the very first one. I want to talk about experience, because we've actually already talked about this in some ways with our conversation earlier. You decided to survey wholesalers about how long they have been an external wholesaler for. And
Mhm.
I appreciated this data because, a huge portion of the respondents, which is close to 600, have over 10 years in field external experience, with almost 27% of them being 20 plus years. And the number is so much smaller for, let's say, 1 to 10 years. So I wanted to ask you this, as someone who has a pulse on the market and hiring trends. Are we in a situation where there's basically seasoned veterans that are out there very much in high demand, and it's more difficult to be an emerging, or let's say younger mid-career external wholesaler?
Uh, yeah, to a degree. I mean, I think from a recruiting standpoint, it's the person who's got depth within their relationships. You know, I always use the analogy of the movie, Moneyball. Why do we like this guy or girl? Because they get on base, right? And what I mean by that is that, they've got the relationships and the depth of relationships within the territory. And if they're good at what they do and they've got a history of success, then they're going to be able to replicate that success within a new firm, right? You can almost look at it from an actuarial model. I worked on a project, Dan, and recruited a person over, and we looked at this individual's background of what they were able to do historically, the number of years within the territory, the relationships that they have, the product set overlapped. And the hiring manager looks at it and says, gosh, there's more of a risk for me not to hire this person. And sure enough, this person gets on board. I called them 4 months later after this individual started. I said, how's it going? What's the latest? And he said, first month, 30 million in the door. Second month, 40 million in the door. The person who is 3 to 5 years into their career, I'm not saying they couldn't do that, right? But the person who's 18, 20 years into their career, the likelihood of them being able to do that is much more possible.
Yeah. For the audience, could you tell us what region of the country that particular person was in? That was
Southeast.
Southeast. Okay. Yeah, I think yeah,
And
as
that's an extreme example, but from a recruiting perspective, when I'm talking to various clients, I mean that's what I'm trying to do. Trying to get to a point to where it becomes undeniable, to where the hiring manager looks at that and says, "Gosh, there's just more of a risk in us in not doing this." Right?
a conversation I had recently was more about a firm developing, they know they need to kind of invest to develop a specific market. They didn't necessarily have like great candidates already in the field with the relationships like the one that you just described. Are you seeing firms think about it, like I need to invest in someone that's younger to go in from scratch? Or are you really seeing the preference in territory relationships? That's the path to success right now.
Well, it depends on who you're working with. I mean, everybody has got a different way of how they set up their offense, right? And how it might work. And I'm not here to pass judgment on saying, hey, the way that you're doing it is wrong, and this is the right way because this is the way these folks do it, right? It's just everybody's, philosophically has got a different approach, right? I know of one group out there where all their folks are, relatively young, right? And they move through a lot of people. They've been very effective with how they do their distribution, and it works for them, right? I made the argument when I was working with this one firm that was coming into the market, trying to go after the RIA community, and we were talking to a lot of folks that were seasoned RIA folks, and they said, well, can't we, bring a person off the desk and what have you? And I just made the point that, as long as it takes to build those relationships within the RIAs, it's going to take a lot longer for, a younger person to establish that. And they just didn't have that sort of timeline, right? But then there's other firms out there that will. In fact, I worked on a project for a bigger organization that was an RIA focused role, and they're willing to give this a lot of time and do what it takes necessary to build it out. And they went with a person who was 2, 3 years in the field, who's had experience with RIAs, and they were going to give this individual the time to make it work. So again, it's just philosophically how you gonna kind of run your offense, and what you see, what might work for one firm may not work for another.
That's great. Yeah, love the range of perspectives there. That's why I like having individuals like you on the horn here on the show to tell us, how the different dynamics are playing out across the industry. So that's the first stat that I wanted to cover here with our experience. So let me bring up our second one here that caught my attention. So I'll be resharing the screen here for everybody. Let's do okay. So territory management. I love it when stats jump off the page, and territory management. This particular one I just thought was really unique. One great question to ask within the survey. So for anyone that's not listening again, or sorry, not watching on YouTube, the survey is how many advisors or buying unit teams can you effectively sell to and service? And over, looks to be around 65% of wholesalers said that they can effectively sell to anywhere between 200 and 350 advisors or buying units. So here's my thoughts on this, Brian, and you tell me if you would agree or have further opinions on it. My first thought as a wholesaler would be, well, of course, I want to cover as many advisors and buying units as I can. I'm never going to say less. So given the survey number, right, like it's interesting to see that. And then the second observation I have is most firms, and even in my own territories, you kind of apply like the 80-20 rule. 80% of your flows or business will come from 20% of the advisors. So if wholesalers can effectively cover between 200 and 350 advisors, that's like a range between what, like 40 and 70 close relationships. So I'm talking a lot here. I just spewed a bunch. What's your
Yeah.
reaction or response to that?
Well, the way that I would look at it is that the number that I consistently hear is 300 that you can effectively service and sell to. And the 300, as it relates to the 80-20 rule, the 300 is the 20, right? Because if I'm working, say, the Texas territory, and we've got a lot of product and we've got firm access through and through, right? I'm honing in on that 300, which is the 20% as it relates to the 80-20 rule. You see my point?
So you're effectively saying that
Yeah, and
so the 300 number is the 20% number. I don't know if I agree with that. I think I'd respectfully
yeah, and
call
again,
BS on that.
I'm not here to say that I'm right, you're wrong, and that any other firm that has a different philosophy, no, listen to me, I'm right, you're wrong. No, this is just what I see and what I hear, right? And so it's not necessarily my opinion, it's just what I hear in the market, right? But I've seen different comp models to where uh, firms will come in and say, "Hey, we're only going to pay you on these advisors." I've seen models to where firms will come in there and they say, "You pick the advisors within your territory, and we will pay you on those. The others we won't pay you on." There are models like that, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, and
Is
I've
that
seen
more
that
recent, would
happen.
you say? Is that a more recent development, or has that been around for a decade or so?
I don't know if you could say that it's recent per se, but uh, it's a model that I've heard about on a couple of different occasions, a real world model that I've seen play out, and some folks like that, others don't. But one sales manager made the point to me, he said, well, look, these folks are going to gravitate towards, the folks that they want to gravitate towards in the first place, right? And so why not play into that, right? But there's an argument to make. I'm a big fan of Don Miller. I don't know if you've ever heard of his program, Marketing Made Simple, and he makes the point all the time that it's stop trying to find new customers. You're going to get more business out of the customers that you do business with and you do business with well, right? Focus in on those folks. And then I remember years ago there was a big LPL advisor who was uh, given his advice and what have you, and his advice to everybody was fire your bad clients. And at first I thought, gosh, that's kind of weird. That doesn't make any sense. Why would you want to fire a client? You're here to work with them. You're here to help them. And then I thought about it a little bit and I said, gosh, that makes a lot of sense, right? And so as you look at this data, it kind of makes sense. But again, as I said before, the number that I hear pretty consistently is 300.
Okay. That's yeah.
And a lot of firms will do this with their distribution where they're saying we're going to focus on the core 300 and then have a hybrid wholesaler work those firms that are within the territory that are outside of the 300. That's quite common.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's consistent with what I experienced at some bigger firms, discussions that I've had with different desk leaders. Yes. So
Yeah,
good
in
to see
fact,
some alignment there.
yeah, in fact, there was a scenario a while back, and I don't even remember how this played out, whether it went through or not, but there was this idea that, okay, I work the Florida territory and I've got all my clients down here, my 300, And the logic was that, okay, we were already doing business with these folks. So, Brian, you're the field wholesaler. We're going to turn those folks over that you have relationships with. You can no longer call on those folks. You go out and get new business. We're going to hand over the existing business. Those folks that were your clients, hand them to a hybrid and an internal and ask you to go out and find new business. And that didn't go over so well. But
I'm
I don't know
picturing
how
the
it played
rage.
out.
I'm picturing the rage of whatever wholesaler was told that they'd have to swap out those relationships.
Right,
Let's
right.
not get in our own
And
way, management. All right.
yeah, but that's the kind of stuff that you'll see now. Again, could it be very profitable? Could have worked out very well? I don't know, right? But it's those sort of stories that I hear, kind of anecdotally that are interesting.
All right. Moving on to our third and final data set from the survey that I wanted to cover here. This is about channelized distribution. I do feel like maybe I'm a little bit of a wholesaler nerd in this sense, but I do love like the nuances and overlaps of different channels and the selling process and what's effective within each one. So you surveyed the wholesalers here and you asked if you would prefer to work all channels versus a channel specific approach. So close to 80% of the respondents prefer to work all channels. You had obviously close to 20% say, I prefer specialization. How do you feel about that? Like, is that something that you're seeing more firms looking for more of a generalist that can cover different channels, or do they require and are more interested in really like a segmented specialist?
It depends who you talk to, and again, it's one of those situations where I can just kind of talk about what I see and hear. Can I tell you what's right and what's wrong? No, right? Uh, but I worked on a situation a while back where there was a great wholesaler, and he said, "Look, I'm going to be making a move here, and the reason why I'm trying to make a move is because they're going to channelize my territory, right?" And within the recruiting process, what you'll find is that people are either running away from something or running towards something, right? And that was the pivot for this individual, right? And you see all kinds of different stuff. There's uh, as it relates to working all channels, you can go a layer deeper and talk about uh, channelization along product, right? Imagine you've got a person who's in, say, again, the Florida market. One person is selling, funds and SMAs. The other person is selling structured notes, and the other person is selling UITs. And they're working all channels, right? And they're covering the same advisors, but they're product channelized, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll see that from time to time. But in general, most wholesalers will tell you they want to work all channels.
Yeah, like I feel like that's like similar to having more advisor coverage. Like, given you want more territory, more turf, more opportunity set, as opposed to less.
Yeah. And I would tell you, one of the other trends that I'm seeing is that harkens back to compensation. It used to be very straightforward in terms of, hey, it's base and basis points. And what you're seeing a lot of now is uh, base basis points and bonus, which the bonus component is becoming a larger factor within the comp plan, whereas it used to be kind of just a gimme, right? At the end of the year, it's become more a larger piece of the pie. And I think a lot of that is goes back to firm profitability, where they are able to do a bonus based on that, because the velocity of money out there uh, is so fluid, right? That the firm can't just sit there and pay out basis points, all the time and then have to claw back, or it removes that. And so they say, hey, we can just work a model where we can bonus on profitability. And then I've seen situations that have come out to where there is no basis points, it's just base bonus, right?
Yeah, I know that that's more common, depending on the type of firm and how the team is set up. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
we
which
talked about
you
that last time. We
yeah,
talked about
and
that last
you
time.
yeah, and I get that, but that kind of cuts against the grain for a salesperson who's looking to be incentivized on sales, right? And so, there's pushback on that front. But, as it relates to comp, no two companies do it the same, and everybody changes it every year. That's the one consistent theme.
That's right.
And
That's
it, and
right.
it, and then my goal gets raised every year. But if you look at it from management's perspective, they're certainly not going to lower the goal.
Hmm.
You can't do that. So it's the management is it's not an easy job. And I think the wholesaling community respects where management is coming from, but there's always, push and pull. That's always out there, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. And we didn't prepare this one as we scripted out our episode, but I do have a quick screen grab or screen share up of the base salary and target comp. And I don't want to like so target comp versus actual realized comp. I'd be curious over the next iteration of the survey, like is that data point when you say target comp, is that intended to say here's what my goal, like here's what my income would be if I hit 100% of my goal, or is that more to say here's kind of what I made over the last year? How would
No,
you say that's framed?
just to clarify there. Okay, so when I'm working on a recruiting project, okay, like I've got a situation going on right now, okay, where there's a territory. Let's just say it's Eastern PA, New Jersey, right? And with the territory as it stands right now is doing X in sales. And if a person walks in there, gets the base salary, and does what the run rate is on right now, they'll come out with, say, hypothetically, uh, 3.25 would be the compensation level. Okay. And I'm talking to you, Dan, who's a New Jersey wholesaler, and you're interested, and you say, well, Brian, my base is 100.25. This year I'm doing well, and I'll make, again, hypothetically 425. Okay. So we're off by 100 grand. The hiring manager's got to know that, right? Because they could come in there and they could say, hey, we really like Dan and we could play at that level. Because for Dan to step back and go to work in this territory and make 3.25 would not make sense, right? So when I'm asking that question and I'm gathering that data, it's I'm grabbing that from you because I'm saying, okay, you're interested in this position, your base is 125 and you're going to make 4.25. That's the data point that I'm working off of, right?
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yes, for
So
sure.
when I say target, you know, target is not what you might potentially make. It's where do you stand right now in terms of projected income? Because you if you were going to make a move, you wouldn't want to do it for less.
Very helpful explanation. And obviously, I like that number or stat better from a production standpoint. It's measured against either existing territory production as opposed to, like your goal, like we talked about a minute ago. Your goals always change. They always go higher. It's like, well, I could be 38% of my goal, but I'm still making 400K. You know what I mean? It's different than saying if you got to 100% of your plan, that would be your income.
Yeah. No, and it's compensation is it's what makes my job really tricky because you've got to be able to be on target in that respect, right? And that's the other thing. I think when people make a move, unfortunately, it's almost as if to say you're only as good as last year's W-2. You can't say, well, you know, Brian, I'm the New Jersey wholesaler, and 2 years ago I made six. I want six, right? They're not going to mark off of that. They're marking off of last year's W-2.
Yeah. Yeah. That's super helpful explanation as always. All right, well, Brian, that wraps up our little preview. Thank you for carving out some time here as always, and thank you for running the survey. Thanks for offering it to the community. And thank you, most importantly, for letting us preview it to our audience here. So if you're not following Brian, I'll link his profile within the show notes, but follow Brian on LinkedIn, subscribe to his email list, get the latest, and reach out if you're someone who's thinking about a career move.
Hey, thanks again, Dan.
Perfect, Brian. Thank you.
Take care.